Okay.
Okay.
All right. Then I'll start with a quick introduction and then I'll hand it over to you. So welcome everybody. Thank you. Thank you for taking the time. Thank you for joining us. As we said before, we know it's a very busy time of the term. So we really appreciate you spending, your break, your afternoon tea, your afternoon coffee with us today. So thank you for coming. And also Elizabeth, thank you for agreeing to have this book launch / I think we can say / research circle, because you'll be talking about your book, but you will also be talking about your writing process, your dissertation writing process. Not going to talk a lot because as you have read, Dr. Elizabeth Bolton, she's a writer and a poet, and she received her PhD from OIC in 2021. She's just told us about how she wrote most of her dissertation during the beginning stages of the pandemic, and I'm sure she will say a bit more about that later. Today, she'll introduce her book, Coronation of the Cosmic Orphan, which is an extension of her doctoral research for which she undertook poetic phenomenological work. Now, in preparation for today, I started reading a bit into her dissertation, and I was tempted to kind of, put some quotes out there for you, but there are so many beautiful sections and it's such unique work. And I've read a lot of dissertations because I'm writing at the moment. So I really feel like your work is very unique. So I encourage everybody to listen to Elizabeth today and then also to check out her book. And if you have access, also to check out her dissertation. And so now I'll hand it over to you. Thank you.
Cool. Thank you, Lisa, for that introduction. I'm going to share my screen. And I have a PowerPoint that I will put into slideshow here for you. All right. So yeah, I'm going to talk about both the dissertation and the poetry book. They were both, I call them both sort of like pandemic projects because they came out of that weird time. So I'll talk about being a writer and poet and just like the path that led from academic research to poetry publishing and and just like the stuff that I'm doing right now. So just a little bit about my background. My PhD is in literacy education. The title is The Poetics of Postpartum, Dwelling in Poetic Space to Parent the Self. It was from the Department of CTL, supervised by Dr. Enrica Picardo. I'm also a creative writer. I think I get to call myself emerging. I think that's the word for like my stage, or maybe I'm like shortly before emerging, of poems, short stories, personal essays, and short pieces on creativity and health, published in literary magazines and like almost no academic. It was just sort of where I put my focus. So that's kind of like the publication history that I have is a creative one. I'm also an associate editor for the Hart House Review, which is a literary magazine on the U of T campus. If you walk over to Hart House, you can just pick up one of those magazines there, and we publish poems, short stories, hybrids, visual art recently as well. So let me know if you ever have any questions about that, about getting published. But I'll just talk about the path that I took to the creative research project. I'll kind of zoom in on the writing process for the dissertation. I'll talk a little bit more about the poetry collection, which I was telling Jennifer was kind of like a piggyback off the dissertation. It happened like really shortly, almost like some kind of physiological response to like the intensity of a dissertation. So they really came together. I have some simple takeaways, I think. And then I wanted to show just a few of the poems. They're really short and they don't take up much space on the page at all. And then answer some questions. So this is just a little bit of a timeline I wanted to show just to point out that for a dissertation like this, a poetic phenomenology on the postpartum depression experience, the way that I did this was that I had my creative writing research, which I was doing as a PhD student, and I also had creative writing craft, and it was like two parallel pursuits that I was putting equal energy into. And they converged at points and they spread apart at other points. They converged for the dissertation, which was very fortunate. But at other times they were very separate. But I was giving a lot of energy to both of them and taking both of them just as seriously for pretty much the whole time that I was doing research. So my craft was this craft of life writing, and that started with the expressive writing course, which I think is in the LLE program. If that's being offered and you're interested in writing, you should definitely take it. It's a course where you practice expressing the events of your own life with clarity and power. And you sort of explore what that feels like to reflect on your own life in a way that's really clear and powerful. And when I was in that class, I met people who were practicing writers who were trying to get published. And so they told me what they were doing, and I started doing the same thing. And these were just people writing about their own personal life experiences. So it was all nonfiction, nothing fancy. You didn't have to be like a person with an MFA or anything like that. People were writing about their own lives and going out and finding literary magazines that publish those types of pieces and pitching their work, and starting to do that just a few months after you've started seriously writing. So I did that just because I met people who were doing it as well. So I started with that class. Fast forward 3 years, and it's time to defend the proposal for this dissertation that has to do with life writing. And I found that there was literature that I was really, really into as a result of the expressive writing course that had a lot of stuff to do with trauma. So there's like a lot of stuff to do with having trauma as your subject matter when you're talking about life writing. And there were these ethical considerations with the dissertation that you just cannot avoid. On the one hand, I actually had to get ethics approval to study myself. I got it very fast, which makes sense, but you still have to get it. So there's these major ethical considerations. And also, I just wasn't sure that I wanted to have that be the subject matter. So I needed a new methodology. I needed one that made the assumption that all writing does something to you, not just trauma writing. And so phenomenology does that. So that was really important. And specifically poetic phenomenology lets you use poetry as your data. And so by that point, I had already been trying to get published for a few years, and I had like a small creative resume going at that point. And then the dissertation happened, and it seemed to happen very organically. And then fast forward another 3 years, right after the dissertation was done, I felt that I needed to put out something else to speak more about this experience in a way that could be, outside of academia. I could talk about spirituality and childhood and like things that were big issues, or you just couldn't validate them as well in academia, but you could validate them as a poet. I like the heart things, Jennifer. Yeah, I felt the same way. It was powerful. So, but my ability to like describe my work and situate it culturally and politically and even like religiously, was like greatly helped by me having a PhD. I don't know that I would have been able to successfully pitch this collection if I hadn't had a PhD. I don't know that that's true for everyone, but it was true for me. It really helped me just to write the little blurb on the back of the book that describes like where I come from, what I'm doing with these poems. In large part, I think I was able to do that because I had a PhD and I had been thinking about these things. So that was the timeline. It was really two parallel pursuits that I was taking just as seriously. So I'm not going to read this whole thing here. I just want to show you the Pennebaker, the literature that I had to cover to validate a project like this actually came from psychology. Pennebaker coined the term expressive writing. So that course, expressive writing, you can't help but come upon Pennebaker's work. He was a psychologist. This was published in 1986 in the Journal of Abnormal Psychology. And Pennebaker was asking undergraduate students to write about past traumas that had happened to them, and then measuring things in their bodies afterwards to see if their health had improved. I'll just read the first line of his abstract here, but according to previous work, failure to confide in others about traumatic events is associated with increased incidence of stress-related disease. So Pennebaker did surveys, and the surveys said that people who had experienced childhood sexual abuse were significantly more likely to experience physical and mental illnesses later in life. And Pennebaker said that was not because of the trauma per se, but because it was a trauma that almost definitely was kept secret, because that's not one that you can say out loud, not in this world, just not easily. So those people were getting ill from the inhibited stress. And so the opposite of inhibition was expression. And so Pennebaker, like a psychologist, was sitting down undergraduate students, asking them to write for a few minutes at a time about a trauma, measuring heart rate, blood pressure, and self-reported moods afterwards, as well as a number of visits to the doctor's office in the 6 months following. And so what happened to people who wrote about their trauma was that their heart rates went up, their blood pressure went up, their moods were negative right after writing. So it was intense for them. But in the 6 months following, they had like significantly fewer visits to the doctor than the people who hadn't written about their traumas. And so this was in 1986, and it was significant enough to just continue the research on writing. But trauma was the starting point for this change. And I think this is kind of one thing that writing can do. Writing about a trauma is incredibly powerful. We knew this back in 1986. All you got to tell me is that people's heart rates skyrocketed after writing. And I'm like, okay, yeah, mine does too. So that's just one thing that it can do. So where do we go from there, especially as academics who don't want to be making a dissertation of a trauma necessarily? We develop a research model that accounts for unquantifiable change, like gradual transformation, and enact theories that allow starting points other than trauma. And that's based on an assumption that all writing does something. And that assumption comes from phenomenology. Phenomenology is what permits that assumption. Even if I write a grocery list, that's a transformation of my experience because it's nonfiction and it's about my life. And that transformation is subtle and not measurable, and it's not going to show up in any, self-reported mood change, but it does something. And so I needed to do a project that accounted for that change and provided like a space where I could show that change. So my questions were, because it was a phenomenology, it had to be questions like this, having nothing to do with healing or anything that like a psychologist is allowed to study. What is it like to inhabit the space of a personal memory through acts of nonfiction writing? And that's including the poetic. And what's it like to inhabit many of these spaces over time? And that was my starting point. So just a little more specifically, what is poetic phenomenological self-study, meaning I used my own writing? Poetic phenomenology is pioneered by Bachelard. He's got two amazing books that all poets should read, The Poetics of Space and The Poetics of Reverie. Really, really beautiful books that were really helpful and supportive to me during this process. They were validating, in fact, because they showed me that I could use my own poetry as evidence of how I was feeling or how I was experiencing the world. So according to Bachelard, poetry offers psychic nearness, meaning an ability to feel my experience, even when you don't know me. Bachelard says that poetry can do that. Good enough writing can do that. A painting can probably do that. Music can do that. These kinds of arts, I think, offer that psychic nearness that is sort of like the reason why this research method is valid. So I'll note that data and results for a project like this are actually combined. The chapters were written like essays, combined data and results chapters. So there were really no formal results that could be presented that were in any way separate from the data. Just some questions that I think might come up, questions that I had because I couldn't find a lot of other poetic phenomenologies out there. What can the data look like? It can look like written, poetized life experience, sometimes in prose, sometimes in verse, and often hybrid. Mine was all hybrid. And there was very little formal narrative in terms of like something that had an actual plot arc. I just couldn't do it during that time. It wasn't the point of things. So very little narrative. How might a self-studying poetic phenomenologist generate data? I selected moments based on them being significant in some way, sometimes just by virtue of the fact that they were sticking around in my head for a long time. And then write freely with the goal of creating resonance, making them resound as poetry. And what that really means is creating writing that somehow gives rise to psychic imagery. That's what Bachelard says about resonance. When it resounds, it's actually a spatial experience. The good writing is dwelling in a bounded space. So the goal was to make it resound, make it spatial. What are the units for analysis? They're not really units, not literary devices, not groupings of words or anything like that. Presence of poetic image. So the words that give rise in this very spooky, enigmatic like way that you can't really intellectualize, those are the units that you are analyzing. It's the poetic imagery that you experience as a result of reading. That's what Bachelard is calling poetry, which is why the poetry in this dissertation it's not in verse, it's not rhyming, it's not really that kind of poetry. It's words that give rise to poetic imagery. So how do you analyze that kind of data? You re-enter the data, meaning you read it again, and then you try to sort of cultivate insight into the essence of the experience that you had. So I'll talk a little bit about what exactly that means. What did I actually do for this writing process? So the first thing I did was select moments. They had to be everyday moments because the everyday was important to me. The everyday took priority over the idea of postpartum depression. I didn't want to write about like, what is it like to be depressed? I wanted to write about, what does the orchid on the windowsill look like when I am depressed? So everyday moments, the depression part of it was really secondary, just sort of bled through it. And then write them in ways that created resonance. I tested them on myself, on editing groups, on my committee members, in order to make sure that we were in agreement that my writing was doing that for people, that it was like good enough. This is just a really small chunk of writing from one little piece about visiting a pumpkin patch with my daughter and my husband, and just being very, very fearful the whole time for inexplicable reasons, just being overcome with fear during this beautiful moment. So what I did was not try to narrate the experience, but just try to create the imagery of it and try to sort of build the psychic space for that memory so that I could enter it and try to understand my experience a little bit better. So the place is called Bryan Farms. It's this pumpkin patch in the Niagara region. And this is the opening line. A line of pine trees, obedient and terrified, divided the red crumbled drive that led to Bryan Farms into clear right and left sides, so visitors would know which side to cling to depending on whether they were coming or going. The road didn't look much like a road otherwise, but an expanse of ruddy, coarse dirt, pocked with mud puddles and punctured down its center line by the trees. So I think the word choice alone has a lot of fear in it. But in fact, the word choice is not even what I looked at. I looked at just the whole imagery of it. And I just saw my fear. I saw that I was just absolutely terrified of this pumpkin patch, this sweet little pumpkin patch on Halloween with my baby daughter, because I had been like so broken by this experience of, being postpartum depressed. And so I was experiencing terror of absolutely everything, including the baby. And later on in the piece, there's like a petting zoo area, and there's a cow that I'm really scared of. And I'm really finding this cow like really majestic and terrifying. And it's just this super intense experience. So that's like the data. And, like, what do I do with that? The whole piece of the whole chapter itself is much longer, and it goes on into like other parts of the pumpkin patch. But how do I analyze something like that? So after I had written the data and confirmed that it actually gives rise to poetic imagery, I then had to analyze it. And I did that by re-entering the data. This is what Van Manen calls the textorium. This is like the solid psychic space of the phenomenological data. When you've built it, you can re-enter it, which really just means reread it. Like, go back to your data, reread it, make sure you're in a calm state so you can really get into the headspace of it, and then tell the story of that re-entry using what's called insight cultivators. And I literally just, on the same page as the data, just continued writing and pulled insights from other writers, a lot of Bachelard, but also like Steinbeck and Dickinson and just other people that I was reading at the time, using their words and their ideas and their stories to cultivate deeper insight into what was happening to me. And that was just based on other words of other people that were resounding with me at the time. And that's really all it was. That's how I found those other texts. So for a piece like that, like the Brian Farms one, I would use this insight. This is from the Poetics of Space, from Bachelard. He has a chapter on immensity in nature. And he says down here, one might say that immensity is a philosophical category of daydream. Daydream undoubtedly feeds on all kinds of sights, but through a sort of natural inclination, it contemplates grandeur. And so I actually saw in that experience, after taking the insight from Bachelard, that what was happening was that I was seeing this immensity in the pumpkin patch. I was seeing grandeur. I was seeing things that were so beautiful that I actually could not bear them in a depressed state. And so I just couldn't feel them. I was feeling fear instead of grandeur, instead of love, instead of intimacy with this moment. I was feeling fear because of the intensity of the moment, which, is an insight that I cultivated about my singular experience that can't really be applied across the board to other postpartum depressions, but is somehow still useful according to poetic phenomenology. So I cultivated an insight such as this one. At Brian Farms, I beheld my own life and the spectacle before me only to the depths I was willing to plunge. In truth, there was no plunge, for the surface of things was as far as I was willing to go. Brian Farms revealed not the depth of my life, but my unwillingness to face it. So that was just like a personal insight that I cultivated using that text, which is, I don't even see that it's a true result or conclusion in any way. Again, this is just a writing, reflecting person using insights to guide them towards understanding the experience in a more essential way. And, this doesn't really make it into a dissertation like this, but the bottom line is that it helps. It helps to think of it that way. Instead of saying, what's wrong with me? Why am I so depressed at a pumpkin patch? You say to yourself, this is intense and my body is doing this in response to it. And so that's kind of what comes out of this style of writing when it's a self-study. So the actual data and results chapters were really long essays with like lots and lots of quotes from favorite novels and poets and things like that. And this is just sort of like a sample of what those words looked like. But the data and results, it was really impossible to separate them. So how do you take anything away from research like that when you don't really have any formal results? I just thought this quote from Bachelard was really great. He says, "It's important to be aware that when our reader is finished reading, he will in no way have increased his knowledge. This will be the price that must be paid for the method we have selected. When we turn inwards upon ourselves, we turn aside from truth." So there's Bachelard saying that what you stand to gain from poetic phenomenology is the enrichment that you get from connecting with another person's words and writing. The price you pay is sort of the gain of like formal knowledge. So depending on who you are, that's either like a really great price or not much of a price at all. So a couple of insights that I thought were useful are that the skills for becoming a published writer, at least that was my personal craft, but I'm sure it's true for other ones too, can be taught and like studied in the same way that a PhD can be studied. And, you know, I think maybe they work really well together. So it works really well to do them in parallel. And also they will have moments of sort of natural convergence, I think, especially when those two paths are really working towards the same end. It's like sort of not okay to use the word healing in academia, but healing was always my end goal. My interest was healing for both of those paths, the research included. So they were separate at times and together at other times. So then the poetry collection came shortly after, and in response to a very wordy dissertation, the poetry collection has very few words. They're sort of miniatures. It further explores spiritual and emotional aspects of early motherhood, including reflection on childhood. The writing process was still phenomenological. It was about taking small everyday moments and making them resound poetically so that some kind of imagery comes up. And I matched it with a publisher based on very specific subject matter. Wipfenstock just happens to publish spiritual academic books, which sounds super random, and I'm not even quite sure how I found them. But I think that is the reason for, and oftentimes I think this is the reason for people getting things published, is because of that great match. So I did a lot of searching to place that collection, and I sent a full-length manuscript in the first place. So I didn't have an agent or anything like that. So I kind of had to do a little bit of extra work to get that out there. It was called Coronation of the Cosmic Orphan. Cosmic Orphan comes from Bachelard. It's a Bachelard quote. I was really interested in the idea of using books and writing to parent yourself in times when you need parenting and you're not getting it. And Bachelard has this great quote about the writing reflecting human, that he is an orphan in the moment of reflecting in writing. He is an orphan in the family of man, and he is beloved by all the gods. And I just thought, what a nice thing to say about sort of the like writing human alone, because I had done so much of that. So I just put that in the title of the book. And the poems are very, very short. This one's called How I Worship. This is how I worship, seated at my desk before stacks and stacks of women, or rather, paralleled and perpendiculared pages upon pages of permission. And that's actually about writing a dissertation, but this is just how I wanted to say it poetically, and it came out really differently than a poetic phenomenology, but it was the idea of like using this research, feeling that this research was having some effect on me, somehow helping me. Terrible news. I am different from you. I have known great wide rainbows, double and dripping, to bring terrible news. The first data chapter of my dissertation starts with me seeing a double rainbow and coming to associate that rainbow with like the start of my postpartum depression. So the idea of a rainbow bringing terrible news was really fascinating for me. In the dissertation, it was like a 20 or 30 page chapter. And in the poetry book, it's just 5 lines. And then I also did some exploration of not of God or like, a spirit specifically, but exploration of the desperation to understand what God is when you are emerging from postpartum depression. It's the desperation that I was interested in. So God's made of meat, meaning like real people, real beings. Oh, beating hearts beneath elegant white heads or broad gray globes or strung from reptilian brains, are you gathered around a great table, nodding over my words, laughing when I get it wrong? Even your laughter, were it a certainty, would be a comfort. And then one other thing I really wanted to do that was hard to do in academia was take big emotions like rage or these big difficult emotions that feel so personal and so shameful, and intellectualize them and like make them like Bachelard's cosmic orphan, make just my personal embarrassing rage into cosmic rage. And I felt that poetry was like a good way to do that. So this one's called Curse, and just comes from being so angry and just not knowing who to direct it at anymore. I wish the pain of quiet understanding upon you. I wish it to break silently over you as a new day. Do you get me? I want horror dawning on you as the sun spills over cold earth, constantly in a hard line, running like a destiny, which comes around for you again and again. And if you'd only see it, only clean it, you could escape it once and for all. But you are a thing of meat, a thing that repeats, a thing of the earth. Again and again, you will come around this place, this Disneyland of the universe. I also had the goal of leaving a lot of white space on the page. And I'm not really sure why I wanted to do that, but I think the dissertation was the opposite of that. There was almost no white space on the pages. So centering poems and making them very skinny and wiggly and these kinds of things was important. Just felt very natural in that time. That's just 4 of them that I was just flipping through that I liked and wanted to show, but the collection itself is only about 80 pages long. It's really a pretty short collection. All the poems are pretty short. These are the references that I've been talking about. Bachelard, I'm pretty sure I got the year wrong, probably for both of those. I'm just not in academia anymore, so I'm sorry about that. But if you look up the titles, you will find them. They are beautiful books. Pennebaker, there's lots more where that came from. That research is very stalled and really needs to be taken up by writers and poets and educators and just people who love books and things like that. But Pennebaker's great. I love what he did. And I think he was the basis. He was the foundation for what I was doing here. And Van Manen is the other phenomenology that I looked at. Van Manen is the one who talks about insight cultivators, pulling from other sources to like help you get to the essence of your experience. And I just wanted to say, if anyone like need or if you like want a copy or like know someone who wants a copy but doesn't have the means, just email me. I have extras, I can send them out. So that's it. I can also answer any questions or anything like that, but thank you for listening. It's been It's been nice speaking to all of you.